Hey, Sun Devils, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm here with you on week 26 of our AP European History class. And this week, we're going to deal with the interwar years. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been dealing with World War I, which up to that point was the biggest war in all of human history. Now that we are moving past that, we also dealt with the Russian Revolution, which started during World War I, but extended well into the 20s. We're going to deal with the 20s and the 30s. It's going to feel like we're dealing with World War II, but we're not going to get into the actual battles yet. We're going to talk about how a worldwide Great Depression helps give rise to extreme political ideologies. On the right, we're going to see fascism, and on the left, we're going to see communism. And we're going to see that when people have instability in their government and when they have instability in their economic system, they're going to turn to anyone who promises to have an answer for them. And we're going to see these ideologies battle it out in the biggest war in the history of humankind. This is the interwar years. So, how does a worldwide Great Depression lead to the Second War and the rise of dictators and totalitarian regimes? Well, let's get into it. There are economic trouble and political instability and a worldwide Great Depression that happened in between the two world wars. If you listened to my class lectures on World War one of the things that you will recognize is how much the United States benefited economically from siding with the Allies in World War One. The United States comes out on top in World War One. By that I mean that none of the battles that took place in World War One were fought on American soil. We ended up on the winning team, and so we got the spoils of war, but we didn't have the casualty count nor the catastrophic devastation from having battles take place in our backyard. And so at the end of World War One, the United States reaches a point where it becomes the number one industrial outputting power in the world. Our GDP and our potential economically hit one of its high points. And we were in this system of creating goods and services, which those old powers like France, Great Britain, and Russia were buying from us. And so, what we talked about during World War One is this huge transfer of wealth from the old world. The old world had spent centuries accumulating the wealth of the world and taking over the world through imperialism. And at the end of World War One, even though technically these warring powers still had all of their colonial possessions, the United States had kind of absorbed the wealth of the rest of the world. And a lot of the world was in debt to the United States through the process of war. It's almost incomprehensible to understand how much World War One costs. So, in the 1920s, the United States is in this huge boom cycle in its economy. We're coming off of this high that was World War One. Our industries are roaring and business is booming. And that's why a lot of times historians will call the 1920s like good times, the roaring 20s. People are coming home from the war, and a lot of the social norms of the time are being challenged because people are saying, hey, life is short, and we just stared hell and death in the face, and now we're going to come home and have a good time. And so people are challenging a lot of the social norms. We get a lot of jazz music and flappers in the United States. It's good times. However, it kind of depends on where you live. If you lived in Germany in the 1920s, it was utter chaos and politically unstable. And Germany didn't really lose the war on the battlefield in World War One. I mean, French and British troops never set foot on German soil, and yet they lost. And so people are very dissatisfied with their government. They kind of feel stabbed in the back there's a lot of unemployment, and Germany is in debt to everyone they lost to, let alone the fact that it cost them money to fight the war in the first place. So it's not good times in Germany, and it's maybe even worse in Russia because remember Russia pulls out of World War One early because they had their own Russian Revolution. They had their own Russian Revolution that was happening at the end of the war, and on top of that, we also get this civil war that breaks out between the Red Army and the White Army. So the 1920s, to say that they were good times, is a way over exaggeration. However, economically, the United States was booming. If you were an African American living in the United States, especially in the South, you were still under segregation policies. So, again, it all depends on who you are and where you were living as to what the 1920s were like. Economic and political problems erupted in Ireland during World War One. Today, there are two countries that share the island of Ireland. There is the northern quarter that's called North Ireland, and it is a part of the United Kingdom. Together with Scotland and England and Wales, it makes up a country, the United Kingdom. But the southern part was also a part of the United Kingdom until World War One. So, in the middle of World War One, the Irish, who had long sought for self-governing and independence from Great Britain or from England, I guess is a better way to say it. The English never treated the Irish very good, and the Irish always felt like they were second-class citizens in the empire. They didn't want to be controlled by England. And so in 1916, during World War One, there's what the Irish refer to as the Easter Rising. And they fight in the streets. They try political channels. There are protest and violence. It's not quite as much upheaval as you would find in Russia during this same time period. Not as violent as it is in Russia. It's also a lot smaller of a place. But still, there's a lot of discord and frustration, and the people of Ireland are sick of being second class in the British Empire. And so Ireland gains its independence in 1922, right about the same time as Russia is becoming the Soviet Union. Now, there were a lot of Protestants and people who were loyal to Great Britain in the northern part of the island of Ireland. And so that's why, like up there in Belfast, the north part stays. So it's just the southern, I would say, three-quarters of the island. If you look on Google Maps, you can see the Republic of Ireland breaks away, but a fourth of the island stays with the British Empire. And so we get the independent Republic of Ireland happening in 1922. Now, by the end of the 1920s, in the midst of this economic roaring times in the United States, there's a stock market crash. And there's a lot of reasons why the stock market crashed. A lot of people saw the potential to make a ton of money in the stock market during the 1920s because the economy was booming. Investing in the stock market can be a great thing, but if you invest in the stock market on borrowed money, like you're doing speculation, you're borrowing money. That is, you're spending money in the stock market or investing money in the stock market that you don't really have. You're borrowing it. So if the stock market tanks a little bit, you're not losing an investment, you're losing a loan. And so there's all kinds of things that were happening. And there were signs, but it's always easier to see things in hindsight. That old saying that hindsight is 2020. In other words, if we look back in history, we're like, oh, look at all these signs. It's so obvious. But when you're living in the moment, it's hard to tell when it's going to happen to you. Some people will say in the year 2021 that we're at right now, that I'm recording this, some people are saying that housing market is starting to get a little bit out of control again. It's kind of going too high and it creates a housing bubble. And when that pops, there's going to be a lot of economic backlash. There was a stock market crash in the US on Black Tuesday, October of 1929, and it sets off global economic troubles. The Great Depression is the worst economic times maybe in the history of recorded history. The thing is, it's not just US history. This, because our economy is really the biggest economy in the world by the end of World War One, because we have economic problems, it's going to have a domino or ripple effect across the globe. And so our economic troubles are going to become the world's economic troubles. And these economic troubles didn't necessarily start in the United States, but the stock market crash is going to set things in motion. The 1930s was a decade known as the Great Depression, where desperate people looked anywhere for answers. And that's the thing. When people are scared, when there's fear, people will turn to radical ideologies, especially if those people promise to fix, the situation. So let's talk about the global Great Depression of the 1930s. With a combination of European debt from World War One, mixed in with the fact that Germany was forced to pay reparations that it couldn't afford, all the while being funded by American loans, and then add a dash of US bank runs and failures, with a twist of the stock market crashing, and you have a recipe for global disaster. And when people are desperate, they'll turn to anyone who promises to have the answers. So, if we look at this little chart, it might not make sense, but obviously this circle represents the United States economy, Great Britain, France, and Germany. Some of the key players in World War One. The United States, of course, these dashed lines and these solid lines have representations. So the United States during the war was taking money from Great Britain, but also was giving her loans, right? And so the Great Britain was sending money to the United States, but also taking loans from the United States. And the same would be true of France. You can see that there are loans coming from the United States to France, and also France sending payments to the United States. Ironically, at the end of the war, Germany is required to pay Great Britain and France a ton of money in reparations. France was particularly bitter about the devastation caused during World War One. The problem is Germany doesn't have money to pay these reparations, to pay back the problems from World War One. So Germany has to borrow money from the United States, promising, of course, to buy US goods, right? So she's going to take loans and she's going to send money back to the United States in order to fund these reparations. Now, if you were to cut one of these lines, so say the stock market crashes in the United States and no longer can we send loans to Germany, then Germany, right, the fatherland here, has no more money to send to the United States to repay those loans. And it doesn't have money to pay France and Great Britain. And if France and Great Britain don't have money from Germany, then they can't pay back their loans to the United States. And it creates this cyclical problem in economics. Okay? The rise of fascism in Europe, unemployment, and economic problems in Italy give rise to ultra nationalism and the rise of fascism during the 1920s. Fascism, what is that? Fascism is a far right political ideology. Fascism is an authoritarian, ultra right wing form of government, often associated with nationalism and racism. The people in the country feel like they're the best. That's the nationalism side. And that often turns to racism when we think we're better than others. Okay? Where the state is more important than the individual. So, one of the key people who really is the brainchild behind fascism is Benito Mussolini. And he likes to call himself El Duce, right? This Italian word, the leader, El Duce. Benito Mussolini forms a group of people known as the Black Shirts. And these are unemployed Italians who feel a sense of belonging and a pride in their country. And Mussolini kind of uses them as his own little hit squad. Now, they don't always go around killing people. Sometimes they'll just rough you up. If you talk bad about the fascist political party, they might beat you up. And it's interesting how he would use these little unofficial, like paramilitary groups to go around Italy and kind of pressure elections and kind of get the political support that he wanted. By the time 1922 hits, he has enough people that are members of his little black shirt clan that he solidifies control of Italy. They call it the March on Rome, and there's tens of thousands of people that show up in Rome, all supporters of Benito Mussolini, and everybody knows that the legitimate government is really kind of going to be controlled by Mussolini. I mean, he's the one who's pulling all the real punches, and he's the one who's really going to be calling all the shots. And so in 1922, by kind of storming the capital of Italy, Benito Mussolini pressures the government to put him in control. Mussolini promises to restore glory to Italy by creating a new modern Roman Empire. So if you ever hear a political leader, this gets scary to me when I hear a political leader say that they're going to make their country great again. Make their country great again at the expense of someone else. That scares me. So Mussolini says, we're going to remake Rome. Remember Rome, the greatest civilization in the history of the world? So, in order to do this, he invades the only spot in Africa that's not claimed by other European powers. Remember during the 1800s, during the scramble for Africa, and people met at the Berlin Conference, and Otto von Bismarck, the great diplomat of Prussia, who helped unify the German speaking peoples into a country in the 1870s. He kind of helps people realize some of the rules and the groundwork for taking over Africa. And in this class, we talked about European imperialism in Africa and the fact that Europeans took over every piece of Africa. Well, during the 1800s, there was really one piece of Africa that wasn't taken over, and that was Ethiopia. So by the 1930s, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party have a strong enough military, and nobody's really in the mood to fight. And so in 1935, he invades Ethiopia. And people had kind of hoped that World War I would be the war to end all wars. But the peace, if there really was peace, was shattered when the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini invades the African country of Ethiopia in the 1930s. Now, next door in Germany, there is a young political wannabe named Adolf Hitler. And he sees what Mussolini is doing during the 1920s. And to be honest, he's kind of envious. He says, I want that same thing in Germany. If I can convince the people to make Germany great again and get people riled up, and we can get jobs for the people who are unemployed, and we can get the trains to roll on time again, people will choose me as their leader. And so Hitler learns from Mussolini and watches how other European countries react. And then eventually he does the same thing in Germany. So oftentimes, because we're viewing this from the year 2021. So when we look back in history, all of us know that Hitler is like one of the most successful, leaders of a country. He's ruthless, he's vicious, he's evil, but he was successful. Sometimes we forget that he learned from Mussolini. At the time, Mussolini was seen as the dominant figure. And it wasn't until World War II actually breaks out and Mussolini can't quite deliver on his promises like Hitler can. In other words, Hitler was better at being bad than Mussolini was. Okay? Here's a picture of the two. Most of you, of course, would recognize Hitler right off the bat on the right. one of the most brutal dictators of all time. And after purging, rivals for his leadership, Hitler is going to rearm Germany into a modern war machine. But next door to him on the left is the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Both Hitler and Mussolini are considered fascists, and they're going to become allies right about this time where Mussolini is invading Ethiopia. And Hitler kind of watches this happen, and he notices that nobody stops Mussolini. They might, say, "Hey, you're stirring up the peace. You're ruining it, man. We just had this giant war, during the World War One. They weren't calling it World War One, right? Everybody called it the Great War. So everybody's like, man, you're stirring up problems again. Why are you doing this?" Hitler's watching this and he's like, nobody's stopping him. So if I do the same thing in Germany, nobody's going to stop me. So during the two wars, World War I and World War II, these interwar years, Germany became a republic. Remember that before World War I, Germany was an empire. It was led by a Kaiser, right? A Caesar, an emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. So after World War I, the Kaiser's out of power, right? Abdicates his rights, and Germany becomes a republic. So in the interwar years, people will refer to Germany as the Weimar Republic. So if you hear people talk about the Weimar Republic, that's Germany in the interwar years. And it was poorly run, and inflation gets out of control. In fact, you can go watch some YouTube videos on how bad the inflation got in Germany in between the wars. If you go back to that thought that we had at the beginning, where we were talking about the fact that Germany is getting loans from the United States to repay its reparations to France and Great Britain, and then Great Britain and France are repaying their loans to the United States, which creates this cycle flow of money. But in Germany, when the money starts drying up in the United States and the loans aren't coming and it gets desperate, it starts to do what we childishly sometimes think will solve the problem. Some people say if the United States is in debt, why don't we just print more money? I mean, the government is the one printing the money. If they are in debt, why don't they just print more money, right? That's the simplistic answer, right? Let's just print more money. It turns out that if you print more money, that money decreases in its value. So pretty soon, it won't cost you $1 for a loaf of bread. If you keep printing money, the value of that dollar will decrease enough that it might cost you $4 or $5 to buy a loaf of bread. What if it costs you $1,000 to buy a loaf of bread? And you might think, Mr. Moore, that's kind of exaggerating, but I'm not. That's what was happening in Germany in the interwar years. I've heard people say that the Deutschmark, that's the German currency, became so devalued that it was better to use as toilet paper or to use as fuel in a fire. It was more valuable to burn the money to heat your home than it was to spend it because of the inflation. So, inflation causes desperate economic conditions in Germany, which allows the fascist dictator Adolf Hitler to rise to power during the 1930s. Hitler was a great speaker, and he promised to get his people jobs and to fix the economy and to bring about a better life, to restore glory to Germany and to make Germany great again. The exact same kind of message that Benito Mussolini was preaching in Italy. We're going to hearken back to this glory day and we're going to make people proud. And they're tapping into patriotism. Now, I believe we should be patriotic. Being patriotic, supporting our country, loving the national anthem, waving flags. My concern is that if we go too far and start thinking our country is better than other countries and start thinking that we're better than other people, that's exactly what happened with the Nazis. That is what makes them the Nazis. They start thinking they're better than everybody else. And they kind of get brainwashed in this ideology in their classes and indoctrinated in their schools to thinking that their country got shafted in World War One. That they're better than the French, than the British, than the Slavic peoples of Europe. The German people were looking for change and hope when the Reichstag burned in 1933, and it's blamed on communists. What's the Reichstag? The Reichstag is the capital building of Germany. Now, I don't know if you pay much attention to politics that go on right now, and I always hesitate to bring in all politics right now because things change all the time. But what was happening in the early 2021, we're talking, right before one of our presidents is leaving and a new president is coming in. There were some people in the United States who stormed the Capitol building. There were some protests. Some people died, and it made international news. What if they had burned our Capitol building to the ground? Now, there was some shooting and there was some looting, and breaking glass and smashing in some doors. But what if the whole building had been burnt to the ground? That's what happens in Germany in 1933. The Reichstag burns. It's the Capitol building of the Weimar Republic. And of course, Hitler's political group are going to blame the communists. And when Hitler comes to power, he's going to ban the Communist Political Party. If anything, Hitler is absolutely anti communist. So there's a terrorist act. Who really set the Reichstag on fire? I don't know if we'll ever know. Some people think that maybe Hitler's own people did it just so they could stir up trouble against the communists. But there's, of course, some people who say maybe it really was communists. Maybe we'll never know. But we do know that Hitler does some pretty underhanded things. If we want to understand fascism in Germany, fascism is a far right political ideology. And in Germany, the political party called itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And we kind of shorten that to Nazi. So if you've ever heard of the Nazis, that stands for the National Socialists. In fact, people would call themselves the National Socialist. Here's the German word, National Socialists, German Workers' Party. When you translate this big fat German word into like an English usable word, Nazi becomes the easy way to say it. And it gains popularity as a political party in the 1930s. I think that's important to realize that not everybody in Germany was Nazis. Not everybody supported the Nazi power. And in fact, at first, there was a lot of opposition against the Nazis. However, Hitler hires a propaganda specialist, somebody to brand his image and make him popular. He almost becomes like a rock star before there even was rock stars. I mean, if I use that terminology in 2021, everybody's like, oh, rock star, famous, right? Popular. Everybody knows him. They got t-shirts with his face on it, right? But this is the beginning of this, what we call propaganda. And so Joseph Goebbels becomes head of Nazi propaganda. And he's charged with protecting the fatherland. Okay. And propaganda is used. The government tries to spread its ideas and promote its agenda. It tries to pump up the Nazi party. I guess there's only two ways to go about it. You can either scare people into doing what you want, or you can get them to love you. And the Nazis are going to do both. They're going to spend tons of money on propaganda to pump up their ideas and make people excited about German culture, German tradition, German superiority during this time. But they're also going to intimidate their enemies. He's going to have somebody called the brown shirts. Mussolini had the black shirts. Hitler's going to have the brown shirts. And they're going to go around and rough people up and start riots. And Hitler's going to step in and say, hey, this is my chance to save the country. So Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, and he has his troops refer to him. referred to him as Mein Führer, right? Der Führer, the leader. Just like Mussolini called himself El Duce. You can see a lot of ways in which Hitler copied Mussolini. Now, in the 1930s, when Hitler and the Nazis were coming to power in Germany, Hitler is going to use a civil conflict in Spain to test his troops. There is another fascist dictator that's going to come to power. Some of you might not be as familiar with Francisco Franco, but the Spanish Civil War broke out in the 1930s during the Great Depression in Spain. Full on civil war breaks out. And communists get involved and back one side, and fascists back another side. And some Americans even volunteer to go over to Spain to fight. You know, they see a chance to actually go fight for a cause that they believe in. And so there's people from all over Europe and even the United States that go into Spain and get involved in the fighting. And there's bloody people are dying all over the place. And both sides call on people to help them, right? The communists, the left, calls on the Soviet Union to back them financially and even send troops if they can. And the fascists, the right, they call on Hitler and Mussolini. And Hitler sees this as a chance to test out some of the military tactics that his troops have been training with. So the Spanish Civil War almost becomes a training ground for the Nazis before World War II actually breaks out. They do some parachuting into some places to test out that theory because nobody's ever parachuted into combat before. They did some high altitude bombing, like if you're familiar with Pablo Picasso's famous painting. Man, one of his most famous paintings is this destruction at Guernica, right? During the Spanish Civil War. This is a great little video that I like to show in class because I'm recording this on YouTube because we're doing, all the learning, distance learning this year. I highly recommend you come back and check out this video. How did Hitler rise to power? And he had these spectacular, huge events where they would pump people up with lights, fireworks, patriotic music. If you've ever gone to a rock concert before, you know there's emotions. And if you've ever gone to like a 4th of July celebration in the United States with fireworks and fiery speeches and talking about how great our country is, that's what was going on in Germany during these rallies, and people were getting pumped up. Nazi Germany before the war. Now, in the 1920s, let's rewind just a second. In the 1920s, Adolf Hitler spent time in jail. Adolf Hitler, he saw what Benito Mussolini did on the March to Rome in 1922, and he wanted to do that same thing in Germany during the 1920s. So he got people rallied up. It's called the Beer Hall Push, and he gets people all psyched up and motivated to storm the streets and to overthrow the Weimar Republic. The thing is, he doesn't have quite the political backing like Mussolini did down in Italy. And so when Hitler first tries to take over the Weimar Republic with force, he fails. And he spends time in jail during the 1920s. And while he is in jail, he writes his famous book, which becomes a bestseller in Germany, Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf means my struggle. And in it, he outlines his vision of what Germany is going to become. And in it, he outlines his view of what the problems are. And he sees non Germans that are living in Germany who are not a part of the mainstream culture and society as the problems. And what he starts to target is the Jewish population. And he sees communism and Judaism as the same basic thing, same basic problem. He outlines his plans for expanding Germany. If you paid attention in this class, you know that Germany was once called the Holy Roman Empire. Very different from the Roman Empire. It's a medieval conglomeration of Germanic states and kingdoms, a confederation, if you will. But the Holy Roman Empire was like the defender of Western, civilization for a long time during medieval times. It was a very powerful political entity. And so he tries to hearken back to these glory days, and he says, if we want Germany to be successful, we need to expand. Empires that are expanding live, and empires that are not expanding are dying. And so he outlines what he calls Lebensraum, right? This living space. And he says the obvious place to go is east. All this open territory in Russia, the biggest country on the planet Earth, now called the Soviet Union, he's going to push into the Soviet Union and expand living space where Germans can grow their country. Okay? He outlines his plans for enslaving the Slavic peoples of Europe. The actual word slave comes from the roots of Slavic, and the German people felt that they were ethnically superior to the people of Eastern Europe. If you're not familiar with Slavic, almost any ethnicity or culture or language group in Eastern Europe is Slavic. There are some countries like Slovakia, right? That's pretty obvious. There was a country called Yugoslavia, the land of the southern Slavs. Um, but the people who are Russian in origin are also Slavic, okay? Ukrainian, they're Slavic. They use a different alphabet. And of course, Eastern Orthodox Christianity kind of dominated in the Slavic parts of Europe. And the Germans see them as outsiders and inferior. In 1934, the Nazis eliminated their rivals in the infamous Night of the Long Knives. Before Hitler becomes chancellor, he has his political rivals killed. One night, he sends out his brown shirts to go stir up trouble and to take care of anybody who's speaking poorly. Shut them up, shut them down. And hundreds of people, top important people, are killed. And it sends a clear signal to everybody else that if you speak out against the Nazis, you're going to die. Hitler took control of the government and established what he called the Third Reich. Reich is the word empire in German. So he's establishing the Third Empire, an empire that would last 1,000 years. So what's the first empire? That's the Holy Roman Empire. What's the second empire? That was the Prussian Empire that was defeated in World War I, right? Started in, really solidified in the 1870s, but falls apart at the end of World War One. So this is going to be the Third Reich, and Hitler promises it's going to last for 1,000 years. The first time that people really started to target the Jewish people was what they called the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. In 1938, the German government officially starts to target Jews in this anti-Semitic movement. And we start to see the Nazis taking control, and we start to see really the rise of fascism in Germany. And of course, there's no shortage of pictures and film and speeches by Hitler. By the time we hit the 1930s, we have video, and so we have recordings of Hitler, and Germany was on the edge of technology, and so Hitler had his own film crew. Way before everybody had a cell phone in their pocket, Hitler had film crews around him 24/7 by the time he gets to power, and so the Nazis are well documented. Now, we're going to pause for a minute because next week when we get into World War II, we're also going to be talking about Japan. And so we need to spend a little bit of time kind of focusing on the other piece of World War II, because it's all going to come crashing together. So we've spent a lot of time. This is an AP European history class, so we focus mostly on European history. But we would be ignorant, and it would be foolish of us to not address what's going on in Japan in the interwar years. This flag right here might not stir up ideas of evil. If I was to reverse and go back and show you a swastika, you would think, oh, evil. Nazis, racist. This is evil. That's a symbol of evil. If I showed you the flag of Imperial Japan, you'd be like, oh, it's just a flag. It's kind of cool. But it had a same kind of connotation during this time period. The Japanese are going to be as ruthless as the Germans, if not more. And the number of people that are going to be killed in Asia during World War II is staggering. So, the late 1800s to the end of World War I, let's take a crack at Japan. If you don't remember this, during the Edo period, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. If you don't remember anything about Japan, remember that Japan was very feudalistic. And Japan stayed in its feudal form until the middle of the 1800s, when it's almost taken over by Europeans. In fact, the Japanese see what Europeans are doing to China, the powerhouse in Asia, and they say to themselves simply, we either need to catch up to the West, or we're going to be taken over by the West. We need to model our system like the Europeans, or they're going to take us over, and we're just going to be their little toy to push around and take whatever they want. During the feudal years of Japan, theoretically at the top of the pyramid would be the emperor. That is, he's the top of the social order. But everybody knew that the true power was in the shogun. The shogun really does run the show. Under the shogun are loyal lords called daimyo, and the daimyo have trained warriors, the samurai, who follow the order of Bushido. So I don't have time to go into all of Japanese history, but if you study Japanese history at all, you know that during medieval times, when we talk about the Renaissance and the Reformation, and we talk about the scientific revolution and exploration, that's all from the European point of view. By the time Europeans discover Japan and find the source of a lot of things they want, the Japanese are still living under this feudal system of the shogun and daimyo and samurai and this honor code of Bushido. And so the Europeans are going to be modernizing, say, middle of the 1700s and all the way through the middle of the 1800s is really that first wave of the Industrial Revolution. And the Japanese are going to get smacked right in the face with this Industrial Revolution and realize that if they don't start to modernize themselves, they're going to be taken over, like everything else in the world. Japan is one of the only Asian countries not taken over during the European imperialist era of the 1800s. During the 1800s, Japan isolated itself from the rest of the world. In 1853, a fleet of U.S. ships led by a commodore named Matthew Perry forced Japan to open trade with the world. The Dutch and the British had already, done their part, so it wasn't just the Americans. But the Japanese see what's happening in China and they're scared. They don't want that to happen to them. So they're going to completely overhaul their society and they're going to try to catch up to the rest of the European countries by the end of the 1800s. Now, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but when I start teaching about World War II, every American grows up knowing about Pearl Harbor. And they know that Japan struck first, right? They were unprovoked and they bombed Pearl Harbor, and that's what got us involved in World War II. But if I rewind the clock 100 years, that's within the lifetime of some people, right? Some people live to be 100 years old, actually a little less than 100 years old. If we go back to the 1850s, 100 years before Pearl Harbor, we can see that maybe it was the United States that struck the first blow because we parked a bunch of our battleships in the harbors outside of Tokyo, and we told the Japanese that if they don't step up and start opening up trade with the United States, we're going to take care of business. Interesting, right? Sometimes we only see one side of the story. Japan learns from the West and industrialized. By the early 1900s, Japan became a leading world power during what they call the Meiji Restoration, a modernization process, going from this old feudal order to a modern industrial powerhouse in 50 years. It's like breakneck speeds, and it's going to have a lasting impact on Japanese society. But by the beginning of the 1900s, whether Europeans wanted to admit it or not, Japan was a powerhouse. And Japan starts to take over other Asian countries, just like the Europeans were doing. Japan gets its little fingers in the China pie, and Japan's going to take over Korea, and Japan's going to take over what we call Taiwan today. And Japan is going to get aggressive, just like the Europeans were, and it's going to play the game. It's going to get into the imperialism game by competing with other European empires. So look at this map for a few minutes. One of my jobs is to try to get students to be able to interpret data on maps. Now, I'm getting ready to talk about World War II next week, and right now I'm dealing with the interwar years. But we kind of have to rewind the clock and see how Japan was expanding in the late 1800s. I mean, look at this. In the late 1800s, Japan is expanding away from its main four islands to outlying islands all around it. Okay, and it's going to eventually in the 1930s start to take over giant chunks of what we call China today, Korea, Taiwan, and it's going to get even more than this. What I'm showing you is leading up to World War II. Japan is aggressive for a long time, and it's going to come into conflict with Russia over this Manchuria area and access to like Port Arthur. And that's what's going to have like the Russo-Japanese War. And who's going to win? The Japanese. And so Japan's going to start to get its reputation, right? And it's really interesting as the samurai end, they're going to take some of the best traits, even if they're mythological traits. They're going to take these traits and kind of incorporate them into a new modern army that's going to be loyal and fierce and almost unstoppable. And that's going to be the army and the Navy and the Air Force that the United States runs into in World War II. And these great flag of the imperial flag of Japan. Um, Japanese imperialism started back when it beats China. Interesting. Little tiny Japan picks a fight with China. Remember all the crap that was going down in China during the 1800s? Remember the Opium Wars? Remember the Taiping Rebellion? Remember the Boxer Rebellion? Well, add on top of that, the Japanese also are seizing territory. And in the Sino Japanese War, this first one, Japan's going to win. Japan's going to beat China, but everybody else had been beating China during the late 1800s. And a lot of it does come back to this drug addiction and this imploding of Chinese society. And then, of course, they're going to pick a war. So little tiny Japan picks a fight with the most populated country on the planet Earth and wins. And then they're going to pick a fight with Russia, the world's biggest country land size. This is before Russia became the Soviet Union. Remember that Russia becomes the Soviet Union during World War I. So this is just a little pre-World War I. The Japanese also defeated the Russian Navy, especially. There was some fighting on land, but they defeated the Navy in the Russo-Japanese War, and it causes spiraling problems in Russia, as we learned last week when we talked about the Russian Revolution. This is the first time a non-European power had beat a major European empire in modern times. The Japanese then took over the Korean Peninsula officially in 1910 and then used brutal tactics to keep it under control. They're going to follow the example of what Europeans did in Africa and what Europeans had done in other parts of Asia during the 1800s. They're going to model themselves after these modern European states. And the Japanese military aggression in China starts in Manchuria in 1931 and then invasion of the mainland in 1937. This is part of World War II, is sometimes called the Second Sino-Japanese War. So when Japan invades mainland China, some people refer to it as the Second Sino-Japanese War. As Americans, we just kind of clump it all as a part of World War II. So when does World War II start? It depends on where you live. If you live in China, in the Manchuria part of China, maybe it started back in 1931. If you were living in Korea and the Japanese invaded and took over, maybe even before, well, this is before World War One, even. So, again, we're talking about two different parts of the world and we're trying to lay down some groundwork. Generally, when people talk about World War II in Asia, they start with the rape of Nanking as the official start of World War II in Asia. The rape of Nanking is one of the most brutal pieces of history in World War II, where the Japanese go in and just slaughter civilians, maybe some military guys that were trying to pretend like they were civilians. So maybe the Japanese had a right to attack them because they were soldiers just dressed as civilians. But whatever happened in Nanjing, it stirs up international concerns. And the United States cuts off oil supplies to Japan. And Japan says, if you cut off our oil supplies, we have no choice but to treat you as an enemy. And thus, they bomb Pearl Harbor. So, if we're focusing on what's going on in Asia, European powers had major influence in China. They never totally took over China during the 1800s, but they did control treaty ports. Remember Macau, remember Hong Kong, Port Arthur is another example. There's lots of ports where they created these spheres of influence. If you remember what happened in China in a previous lecture, we talked about European imperialism weakening China and bringing about the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912. Remember the Taiping and Boxer rebellions, right? After this, China has like a century of turmoil. In fact, China is just, I think, coming out of and recovering from all the problems of the 1800s. In the year 2021, China is the second biggest economy in the world. Its military is powerful. Its influence globally is so significant. China is just starting to come into its own. The Republic of China was a short lived, right after the last imperial dynasty of China falls apart, the Qing dynasty, there's a short time where China is a democracy. And one of its most important leaders was Sun Yat sen. And Sun Yat sen, he doesn't really control all of China because most people know that outside of his capital, Nanjing, um, there's warlords and Europeans that control, and even the Japanese. So to call China a republic and a democracy, if anything, it was really short. And during these years, there's going to be the stirrings of communism. And ultimately, by the end of World War II, the communists are going to take over all of China. China's going to be devastated. We're talking millions, probably more than 20 million people are going to die throughout this whole process. Well, I mean, if we go all the way back to the Taiping Rebellion, we could probably easily say 100 million people. This 100-year chunk of time from the Opium Wars to the end of the Communist Civil War in China is maybe one of the most deaths ever recorded in the history of humankind. It's staggering. And a lot of Americans aren't even familiar with it, you know. We like to talk about our Civil War in the 1800s and how bad that was. 500,000 people died. 600,000 is a number that historians claim. The Taiping Rebellion alone was probably 20 million. And if you add on top of that World War II and the Communist Revolution and Civil War in China, I think it would be easy for us to say that 100 million people. It's catastrophically huge. After the last emperor of China was removed from power, a civil war engulfed the country for decades. Warlords really ran it. The communist forces were led by a guy named Mao Zedong. In a lot of lists, he gets the number one spot as the most evil person in history, or at least the guy who's responsible for the most deaths. if you're a Chinese national right now, you might think Mao Zedong's a good guy because he's a hero. He ended the old order in China and brought in the People's Republic of China, the communist government. So a lot of people in China look to him as a hero. A lot of us, though, in the West, we see him as a bad guy. Like, couldn't be worse than Mao Zedong. And he's going to fight against a guy named Chiang Kai shek. I'm going to bring their names up during World War II because they're going to be leading opposing forces in China. They're going to kind of stop killing each other for a while and fight the Japanese. But once the Japanese are defeated in World War II, they're going to go back to killing each other. The two groups stopped fighting, like I just said, for a little while when the Japanese attacked China during World War II. There's so much we could talk about. It's tough to know exactly how much you already know and how much you need to know for a European history class. But this is one of the most famous parts of the communist revolution in China, when Mao Zedong is leading his group of communists on what they call the Long March. As the nationalists, kind of like Chiang Kai shek and his army, the Kuomintang, try to destroy the communists. But in the end, after World War II, the communists are going to come out on top. The Chinese Civil War is divided into two stages, the first being before World War II, and the second being after World War II, with World War II in the middle. So, talk about devastating decades, right? Eventually, the communists win the Civil War. I just showed you a little map, a little diagram of the Long March, right? The Communist Long March was during 1934 when Mao Zedong led his followers on a 6,000-mile journey through the Chinese countryside, recruiting people to his cause. And the National Army, the Kuomintang, or the KMT, sided with the U.S. during World War II to fight the Japanese. When World War II was over, the U.S.-backed Nationalist Army, the KMT, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, they're driven out of China to the island of Formosa, which is called Taiwan today. In fact, if you want to know if Taiwan is an independent country, that's a really tricky question to ask. Most people will say that Taiwan is an independent country, but they won't say it to China's face. Everybody knows it, but everybody refuses to acknowledge Taiwan as independent. They have to kind of bow to communist China still to this day. In fact, the only US president that I know of that contacted the president of Taiwan officially as president was Trump. Trump was one of those leaders who kind of like to poke the bear. He didn't play by the regular rules of international diplomacy. No US president would ever directly call the president of Taiwan because they were afraid to piss off China, but Trump did. He kind of liked to stir the pot a little bit. So, some really interesting stuff. The communist leaders in China and the Soviet Union helped North Korea to fight against the US and her allies during the Korean War. So, China and the United States have never directly fought a war, but we got involved in the Boxer Rebellion. We got involved in China during World War II. We sided with the Kuomintang during the Communist Civil War. And of course, we sided with nationalists in Korea during the Korean conflict, even after World War II. China and North Korea are some of the only remaining communist countries in the world today. So, does it matter? Yes. To recap, we're dealing with the interwar years. There's always some great videos that I put, to try to help students or people who want to learn more about in between the wars. But we talked about the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, places like Ireland and Russia falling apart during and after World War I, the rise of Japan to a powerhouse, and really some of the destruction of China and its problems, both before World War I and even way to after World War II. Thanks for joining me. This is week 26, the interwar years.